There was a time, not so long ago, when those three letters carried more weight than almost anything else in entertainment. HBO Home Box Office. A name that didn't just represent a television network, it represented prestige. It represented ambition. It represented the audacious belief that television could be art. The network that gave us The Sopranos, The Wire, Game of Thrones, Succession, Deadwood, 6 Feet Under, Curb Your Enthusiasm. A network that, for decades, didn't compete with the rest of television. It embarrassed it. But something went wrong, and today we're going to talk about how one of the greatest institutions in the history of American storytelling lost its way, and what that loss means for all of us. To understand the fall, you have to understand what HBO was. Founded in 1972 as a cable channel for movies and boxing matches, HBO spent its first 2 decades as a premium but relatively conventional service. You paid extra. You got movies without commercials. That was the deal. But then the 1990s happened, and everything changed. Network television had always been built on a simple premise: keep the advertisers happy. You couldn't show too much blood. You couldn't show nudity. You couldn't have characters that were too morally compromised, because Ford or Coca-Cola wouldn't want their family-friendly commercials playing next to a mobster beating a man to death over a gambling debt. HBO didn't have advertisers. They only had subscribers. This meant they didn't have to censor themselves. They didn't have to appeal to the lowest common denominator. The executives at HBO gave creators something unprecedented in television history: massive budgets and absolute creative control. Their philosophy was fewer, better. Make fewer shows, but make them undeniable. In 1997, HBO premiered Oz, a brutal, uncompromising drama set inside a maximum security prison. It wasn't like anything network television had ever aired. It was violent. It was morally complex. It didn't apologize for itself, and audiences were transfixed. Then came The Sopranos in 1999. There is a before and an after when it comes to The Sopranos. Before it, the idea that a television series could be the artistic equal of the greatest novels or films was a fringe opinion. After it, that idea became undeniable. Tony Soprano, a mob boss in therapy, a murderer who loved ducks, became one of the most discussed fictional characters in modern history. The show ran for 8 years and won 21 Emmy Awards. When it ended in 2007 with one of the most debated finales in television history, critics didn't just mourn a show, they mourned an era. But HBO didn't stop there. The Wire debuted in 2002. Dismissed at first, it has since been called the greatest television drama ever made. A sweeping, devastating portrait of Baltimore that examined crime, politics, education, and journalism with the depth and rigor of serious literature. Deadwood reconstructed the American West. 6 Feet. Under dissected death and family, Rome brought ancient history to cinematic life. Entourage captured Hollywood vanity. Curb Your Enthusiasm turned social awkwardness into high art. In the 2000s, HBO wasn't just winning awards, it was defining culture. It was setting the standard that every other television network, streaming service, and studio would spend the next 2 decades desperately trying to match. And then, very slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to change. The problems didn't appear overnight, they crept in. First came the question of what comes next. After The Sopranos, The Wire, Deadwood, and 6 Feet. All ended within a few years of each other. HBO faced an enormous challenge. How do you follow that? How do you replace a murderer's row of talent that had spent a decade redefining the medium? The answer initially was, you don't. Not really. HBO tried. Shows like Trem, Luck, and Boardwalk Empire had genuine ambition, but none of them reached the cultural heights of the golden era. True Blood was enormously popular, but deliberately pulpy, a different kind of prestige. Girls, created by Lena Dunham, was bold and provocative, but it was also smaller and more divisive. Then came something that looked at first like a triumph. Game of Thrones premiered in 2011, adapted from the epic fantasy novels of George R.R. Martin. It was the most expensive television production in history, and it showed. The production values were extraordinary. The storytelling, in its first 4 or 5 seasons, was some of the finest in HBO's history. By its 4th season, Game of Thrones wasn't just a hit, it was a global phenomenon. Nearly 20 million Americans watched each episode. It was pirated more than any other show in history. Fans in countries where HBO wasn't even available found ways to watch it. It had transcended television entirely, and then it collapsed. Seasons 7 and 8 of Game of Thrones represent one of the most spectacular creative failures in modern entertainment history. As the showrunners David Benioff and D.B. Weiss outpaced George R.R. Martin's unfinished novels, the story unraveled. Characters were abandoned. Logic was discarded. Arcs that had been built over 7 years were resolved in ways that felt arbitrary and hollow. The final season aired in 2019 to near universal audience outrage. A petition demanding a remake of Season 8 gathered over 1.8 million signatures. For HBO, the damage went beyond bad reviews. Game of Thrones had been the network's greatest modern achievement, and its ending exposed a troubling question. Had HBO lost the creative judgment that had once made it great? But the Game of Thrones finale was only part of the story. The real crisis arrived in the form of a spreadsheet. By 2018, AT&T had completed its massive $85 billion acquisition of Time Warner, the parent company of HBO. Almost immediately, the executives who had overseen HBO's golden era found themselves answering to telecommunications managers. The network that had been built on the philosophy of fewer, better, was suddenly told it wasn't doing enough. Netflix had 150 million subscribers. Disney Plus was about to launch. Prime Video was spending billions on its streaming catalog. The message from AT&T's boardroom was clear. HBO needed to scale up, and it needed to do it fast. And so, in May 2020, HBO Max launched. The idea was to bundle HBO's prestige library with thousands of hours of additional Warner Media content, movies, reality TV, animated series, documentaries, and compete directly with Netflix on volume. The problem was that this was precisely the opposite of what had made HBO great. Imagine walking into a Michelin star restaurant, sitting down for a meticulously crafted tasting menu, and the waiter hands you a greasy, lukewarm burger from a fast food drive-thru. That was the experience of navigating HBO Max. It was a jarring, discordant mess. The executives believed that volume was the only way to win. They thought if they just threw enough content at the wall, the subscribers would stay. But in doing so, they began to commodify the very thing that made them special. HBO's identity had always been built on scarcity and quality. The whole point of "it's not TV, it's HBO" was that HBO was better. When you added hundreds of mediocre hours of content to the same platform, you didn't strengthen the brand, you diluted it. Casey Bloys, HBO's content chief, understood this. He pushed back. There were genuine internal debates about whether the network could preserve its identity while absorbing the scale demanded by the streaming wars. Those debates were largely lost. Then, in 2022, the financial reality of the streaming wars caught up with them, and things got much worse. AT&T spun off Warner Media, merging it with Discovery Inc. to create a new company, Warner Bros. Discovery. And the man who took charge of this new entity was David Zaslav, a cable executive whose philosophy was, to put it charitably, different from the one that had built HBO's reputation. But to understand the true scale of the devastation, you have to look at the math. When Warner Bros. Discovery was formed, it didn't just inherit a legendary television network. It inherited a crushing, catastrophic mountain of debt. $50 billion. David Zaslav wasn't brought in to be a visionary. He was brought in to be an executioner. Wall Street didn't care about Emmys anymore. They cared about profitability. And Zaslav's mandate was simple: cut the bleeding, whatever the cost. Under Zaslav's leadership, Warner Bros. Discovery immediately began aggressive cost-cutting. Shows were canceled mid-production. Completed films were shelved and written off for tax purposes rather than released. Batgirl, a finished $90 million superhero film, was simply deleted from existence. The cuts were brutal, but the cancellations were just the beginning. What came next was a profound betrayal of the network's legacy. Zaslav started pulling original HBO series off their own platform. Shows that defined the network were quietly scrubbed from the internet. Why? Because keeping them on the app meant paying residuals to the actors and writers. To save pennies on the dollar, art was simply erased. Westworld, a sci-fi epic that had cost hundreds of millions of dollars to produce, a show that was nominated for 54 Emmy Awards, was removed from the platform and sold off to free, ad-supported streaming channels like Roku and Tubi. Imagine painting a masterpiece and then selling it to be printed on cheap paper plates. That is what happened to HBO's prestige catalog. Then came the decision that shocked the industry. In the spring of 2023, Warner Bros. Discovery announced that it was rebranding HBO Max, dropping the HBO name entirely. The new service would simply be called Max. The reasoning was corporate. The executives argued that the HBO brand was confusing to consumers. They claimed the name pushed away families who associated HBO with adult, violent content, and that people didn't understand why reality TV like 90 Day Fiancé and nature documentaries were on the same service as Succession. But to anyone who cared about what HBO represented, the decision felt like more than a rebranding. It felt like a funeral. The HBO name had taken 50 years to build. It meant something. It was a signal to writers, directors, actors, and audiences that what you were about to watch had been made with seriousness and care. Stripping that name from the service was, symbolically, an admission that the old promise could no longer be kept. Richard Plepler, who had served as HBO's CEO from 2013 to 2019 and who had overseen Game of Thrones, Succession, True Detective, and Girls, was watching from the outside. Plepler didn't just run HBO, he curated it. He understood that prestige wasn't just a marketing buzzword. It was a fragile ecosystem built on trust. He had left HBO after the AT&T acquisition, reportedly frustrated by the new corporate culture that valued engagement metrics over artistic merit. He knew that great art couldn't be mass-produced on an assembly line. He didn't say much publicly, but the industry understood what his departure had meant. HBO, as a culture, had left when Plepler did. What remained was the catalog, the brand name, and a new corporate parent that valued subscriber numbers over storytelling. To be fair, HBO didn't stop making great television entirely. Succession concluded in 2023 with a final season widely considered among the finest in television history. The Last of Us debuted to enormous critical and audience acclaim. The White Lotus became a global cultural moment. The talent was still there. The creative infrastructure still existed, at least partly. HBO could still make brilliant television when given the resources and creative freedom to do so. But there were fewer of those moments. The budgets were tighter. The decision-making was more cautious. The bold swings, the Deadwoods, the Wires, the shows that no rational business person would greenlight, but that turned out to be masterpieces, were becoming rarer. And the things that surrounded those moments on Max were increasingly indistinguishable from what you'd find anywhere else. There's a question worth sitting with here. Does any of this actually matter? Television has never been better, by some metrics. There are more high-quality shows available today than at any previous point in history. Netflix, Apple TV+, Prime Video, and FX all produce work that would have been remarkable by any previous standard. Prestige television is not going away. But HBO was something specific. It was an institution, and institutions carry meaning beyond their individual products. When you knew something was on HBO, you knew that it had passed through a particular filter. A filter that asked, is this worth making? Is this true? Does this illuminate something real about human experience? That filter was imperfect. HBO made plenty of forgettable television over the years. But when it worked, the results were extraordinary. And the existence of that filter, the possibility that television could meet that standard, mattered enormously to everyone who worked in the medium. Without it, everyone operates a little differently. Writers pitch more safely. Executives think more about subscribers and less about stories. The margin between good enough for television and this might be one of the greatest things ever made shrinks a little. That's not a crisis, but it's a loss, and losses accumulate. HBO's story is in many ways the story of modern American media. It's the story of what happens when a creative institution becomes an asset on a balance sheet. When the people who built something extraordinary are replaced by people who have never made anything, but who understand with great precision what it costs to make things. It's the story of the streaming wars, a race to scale that transformed television from an art form with commercial qualities into a commercial product with artistic aspirations. And it's the story of what we lose when we allow business logic to override creative courage. HBO hasn't disappeared. Max is still here. Great shows are still being made under the HBO banner. The name survives, even if it has been stripped from the streaming service itself. But the idea of HBO, the institution that believed, without irony, that television could be as serious and as meaningful and as beautiful as any other art form, that idea is harder to find today than it used to be. And we are all, in some small way, poorer for it. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. I want to know what you think. Is HBO still the gold standard of television, or has it become just another piece in the corporate machine? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe if you want to keep watching, because some stories are still worth telling.